Good afternoon. I'm Lucas Morel, the class of 1960 professor of ethics and politics here at Washington and Lee University, and also head of the politics department. I'd like to thank Rob Fure and the Office of Special Programs for their invaluable aid in producing this year's Institute for Honor Symposium. It has a mission to promote the understanding and practice of honesty as an indispensable element of society. My special thanks on behalf of Washington and Lee University go to the class of 1960, who established the Institute for Honor at their 40th reunion and gave a substantial class gift at their 50th reunion to sustain this annual symposium. To put this in perspective, I've been teaching here at Washington and Lee for 16 years, and these guys have been celebrating their days at Washington and Lee longer than I have been alive. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Where are these guffaws coming from? It's my hope that our weekend symposium pays some tribute to their devotion to the concept of honor as an abiding legacy of their years here at Washington and Lee. This year, the nation commemorates the sesquicentennial of the end of the American Civil War. 2 weeks ago, the National Park Service marked the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's second inaugural address. In fact, if you had traveled there on March 7th, a cold but sunny Saturday morning, you actually saw Lincoln delivering a speech in front of his own statue. It's pretty good. In a few weeks, the National Park Service will commemorate Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Now, I've just given you the lineup of 3 key figures who will command our attention and scrutiny during this symposium, which we entitle From Civil War to a Civil Society, Achieving Peace with Honor. What can we learn from Lincoln, Grant, and Lee regarding how America should reunite as one country as the nation recovered from a near fatal conflict of aims, its greatest trial since its founding? Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I would like to take a little time to set the context, not just for his talk, but for the weekend's lectures and the ensuing discussion that I'm sure the symposium will generate. So allow me to begin my symposium, our symposium, with a quote from another research interest of mine, Ralph Ellison. He mentions a number of things about the Civil War that intrigue him. We are a people who, while desiring identity, have been reluctant to pay the cost of its achievement. We have been reluctant since we first suspected that we are fated to live up to our sacred commitments or die. And the Civil War was the form of that fateful knowledge. It's precisely this reluctance to pay the cost of becoming fully American, establishing our identity among the nations of the world, that I believe is on display when we consider the various modes of reconstruction that were proposed at the close of the Civil War. Lincoln, Grant, and Lee had distinctive roles to play, both during the war and as it wound up. How each of them understood the cost of American Reconstruction, its corresponding benefits, I trust, will prove enlightening despite the century and a half that has passed as the United States developed socially and politically. Now, the protagonist of Ellison's unpublished novel, which was published in part as Juneteenth in 1999, there's a preacher named Alonzo Hickman who says of a former protege of his, who's now a senator, a protege that has rejected him and the Southern black community that raised him, he says he's got them caught between what they profess to believe and what they feel they can't do without. This gap between what Americans profess and what they practice was the focus of a missing character in our weekend's lineup, and that character is Frederick Douglass. When Lincoln called for the nation to experience a new birth of freedom, as he spoke on a portion of the Gettysburg battlefield in the year of Jubilee, the year that followed his Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass believed it was intended as a call to the nation to live up to its original promise that all men are created equal. In January of 1865, speaking before the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, Douglass devoted most of his speech to, quote, the immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of the black man. Without the vote, instead of enslavement to an individual master, the freedman would simply become the slave of society. Denying blacks the right to vote was especially damning in its effect upon public opinion in a nation where suffrage, at least for men, was understood to be universal. Douglass said, "To rule us out is to make us an exception, to brand us with the stigma of inferiority." Douglass could not abide any law or policy that contradicted the principle of human equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. For Douglass, the government of all should be partial to none, offering the equal protection of its laws to all of its citizens. But what is most striking about Douglass's argument for blacks being able to vote at the war's end is what he called America's sense of honor, the American sense of honor. He basically argued that America's self-respect was at stake. For shame if they asked blacks for help when warred upon by white Southerners, but then denied blacks the vote when peace returned, and they, those self-same blacks, had to live amidst those whose wrath they incurred by siding with the North. There is something too mean in looking upon the Negro, he said, when you're in trouble as a citizen, and when you are free from trouble as an alien. Shall we be citizens in war and aliens in peace? Would that be just? Douglass fully expected that what he called a hostile spirit would pervade the former Confederate States of America. He said, they will endeavor to circumvent, will endeavor to destroy the peaceful operation of this government. And so many 1,000 gone, not to mention so much treasure lost in the Civil War. Even with the abolition of slavery, Douglass would not allow the nation to go back to the Union as it was. For the war to mean something, preserving the Union had to produce not simply the survival of self-government. It had to advance, consistent with that, the protection of the rights of black Americans. In this, I believe Douglass had a friend in Lincoln. Although Douglass was a fierce critic of Lincoln during the war, after meeting with Lincoln twice, consulting with him on the progress of the war, and pursuing greater fairness for black troops, Douglass grew in his appreciation for the difficulties under which the president labored. He later acknowledged that if Lincoln moved too quickly on behalf of full justice for black troops, quote, all the hatred which is poured on the head of the Negro race would be visited on his administration, end quote. After the war, Douglass wrote, Mr. Lincoln was not only a great president, but a great man, too great to be small in anything. In his company, I was never in any way reminded of my humble origin or of my unpopular color. If only the laws of the several states would have imitated this posture of Lincoln towards Douglass. Unfortunately, a formerly divided people had divided to the point of civil war. This division stemmed from a disagreement over the very meaning of America, which at its center was a disagreement over slavery, its legitimacy, and therefore its future in the American Republic. Aristotle once wrote that revolutions in regimes occur due to factional conflict. By this, I think he means when two sides disagree over the meaning of justice. In the American case, what do individual Americans deserve from their common government, the federal government? Most white Southerners, only a minority of which, owned black slaves. They came to believe that the election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, represented the culmination of decades of efforts to subvert and ultimately eliminate the institution of slavery in the United States. While Lincoln said repeatedly that he intended to return the peculiar institution to the path the American founders put it on, the course of ultimate extinction, white Southerners thought they knew better. By banning the importation of slavery, preventing its expansion into the Western territories, which is to say areas that would eventually become American states, it was only a matter of time, they thought, before the electoral math would spell the demise of slavery. If not by outright congressional ban, then by a constitutional amendment that they could not stop. In addition, the aim of what they saw as an abolition party, pejoratively referred to as the Black Republican Party, was most evident, not simply from words, but also from actions in exclusively northern states, namely the passage of personal liberty laws designed to promote the due process rights of the accused, especially if a black person in the North was alleged to be a fugitive slave and therefore bound under federal law to be returned to his putative owner. As Southern states understood it, free state interference with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a failure to fulfill their obligation under the United States Constitution. This Constitution was viewed by most white Southerners as a compact of states, a league, not in the fullest sense a true national government. The federal government could only bind all the parties to that contract, the American states, if all the parties complied with all of its stipulations. One of them read as follows: "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." So when northern states began disrupting the process of apprehending or prosecuting alleged fugitive slaves, thereby disobeying the federal Constitution's guarantee of the right of a slave owner to the return of his slaves, those states were breaking the Constitution, and therefore no parties to that contract were bound to abide by it if they believed their interests were no longer going to be served by complying with it. They were released from their constitutional obligation and were again free and independent states, could exercise their sovereignty by forming new alliances that would promote their safety and well-being. As Confederate President Jefferson Davis put it, the Constitution had been perverted from the purposes for which it was ordained, had ceased to answer the ends for which it was established. So, one slave-holding state after another passed secession ordinances affirming as much, eventually forming the Confederate States of America. Its Vice President, Alexander Stephens, declared that the Confederate States of America Constitution was established, quote, "upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." Stephens added, "Our new government is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Needless to say, Lincoln and a goodly portion of the northern citizenry, as well as some white citizens of the South, disagreed. And they were willing to defend the American Union from an attempt to destroy it, a nation they did not believe was merely a compact of union, to use Jefferson Davis's phrase. So this difference between Unionists and secessionists foretold the difficulty of reuniting the nation once the war ended. But before the war ended, Lincoln was mindful that how the war was fought and brought to a close would shape how the peace would be practiced. And I'd like to mention two quick examples of how Lincoln tried to communicate this to the country. One happened before the Emancipation Proclamation and one after. And these were but two ways that Lincoln used to try to get white Americans to see that the American soul was large enough to be hospitable to blacks. We'll see that in the second example, Lincoln goes to almost Shakespearean lengths to situate blacks as full-fledged Americans due to their experience as soldiers in the American Civil War. Now, not many people know that Abraham Lincoln was the first president to hang a man, Captain Nathaniel Gordon of Maine, for importing slaves into the United States. He refused to commute the sentence to life in prison, but postponed the execution. Here, Lincoln: "It has seemed to me probable that the unsuccessful application made for the commutation of his sentence may have prevented the said Nathaniel Gordon from making the necessary preparation for the awful change that awaits him." So Lincoln granted him a respite, as he put it, of the above recited sentence. 2 weeks. Why? Here's Lincoln again. Captain Gordon, relinquishing all expectation of pardon from human authority, refer himself alone to the mercy of the common God and Father of all men. Nathaniel Gordon was notorious not simply for trading in slaves, but trading enslaved children because they were easy to control on the ship, and he could pack more of them in. So less than a year into the war, Lincoln wanted the nation to recognize the humanity of blacks, became willing to be known as the first American president to hang a man for the crime of slave trading. That's how serious he thought the federal government should enforce a law that had been on the books unenforced for over 40 years. 2 years later, Lincoln reaffirmed this conviction after he issued his momentous decree of emancipation, which included a proviso for the enlistment of freed slaves into the Union Army and Navy. He wrote a letter that was intended to be read at a gathering of pro-Union supporters in Illinois, but supporters who were dissatisfied with the president regarding emancipation and black troops in particular. This is Lincoln. He said, "Some of the commanders of our armies in the field who have given us our most important successes believe the Emancipation Proclamation and the use of colored troops constitute the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebellion, and that at least one of those important successes could not have been achieved when it was, but for the aid of black soldiers." And he added, "But Negroes, like other people, act upon motives. Why should they do anything for us if we will do nothing for them? If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom. And the promise being made must be kept." So Lincoln made clear his determination not to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. But my favorite statement in this letter, he added a note to the letter and said, "I only have one piece of advice for you. Read it slowly." My favorite statement comes near the end, and it focuses on the war's end. And the war isn't anywhere over. It's a good year and a half to its close. But he focuses on the war's end and what would be the nation's memory of it. This is Lincoln. "And then there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue, clenched teeth, steady eye, well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to this great consummation. While I fear there will be some white ones, unable to forget that with malignant heart, deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it." Here we see, I believe, shades of Henry V's St. Crispin Day speech. "These wounds I had on Crispin's Day." Lincoln foresees a day where black men will stand a tiptoe upon the mention of this or that battle of the Civil War in which they fought, while other men, other white men, will, quote, "hold their manhoods cheap because they did not fight the good fight to preserve the Union because of their inability to accept blacks. We band of brothers indeed." With this last example especially, Lincoln tried to prepare the country for what he would call just a few months later a new birth of freedom, which he addressed, of course, in his sublime second inaugural address. Suffice it to say, the war may have been long, the devastation vast, but slavery in America had been around a lot longer. It was this reality, coupled with Lincoln's Emancipation Decree and Congress's 13th Amendment, neither of which was seriously expected as a consequence of the war. These things shaped the president's remarks at his second inauguration. Could he find a way to resolve the conflict, both justly and honorably? That was the task he set for himself as he prepared his second inaugural address. So if our greatest conflict and its aftermath taught us anything, it demonstrated that winning the war did not automatically create the conditions of a lasting peace. In the case of the American Civil War, the president who won the war did not live to win the peace. That was left to others to sort out, what Lincoln knew would be a challenging transition. That said, the re-elected president used his bully pulpit in the waning months of the war to help the nation think through that transition, most especially at his second inaugural. When he was officially notified of his re-election on March 1st, he replied with assured reliance on the Almighty, who has so graciously sustained us thus far, and with increased gratitude to the generous people for their continued confidence, I accept the renewed trust with its onerous and perplexing duties and responsibilities. Earlier in the war, Lincoln said to Congress that the occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. He was then referring to an emancipation he intended to announce in the new year, but it was precisely that emancipation and the world, especially in the South, that it would produce that would pose the greatest challenge to a reunified country once the war was over. But as a wartime commander-in-chief, Lincoln made clear his intention to stand by his decision regarding emancipation and therewith the enlistment of black troops. Lincoln said, "There have been men who have proposed to me to return to slavery the black warriors of Port Hudson and Olustee, to their masters, to conciliate the South. I should be damned in time and eternity for so doing. The world shall know that I will keep my faith to friends and enemies, come what will." Echoes of this are heard in Douglass's fear that the nation might pursue a peace with the defeated secessionists at the expense of faithful blacks, to reward her enemies and trample in the dust her friends, as Douglass put it. His fears, of course, proved tragically true when a decades-long attempt at Reconstruction faltered, as white Northerners eventually gave way to white Southern intransigence regarding the equal protection of blacks. So, after an interview with Lincoln in August of '64, one man described the president as the great guiding intellect of the age, adding, "He was heaven's instrument to conduct his people through this Red Sea of blood to a Canaan of peace and freedom." To help us see this intellect at work, how our dear Father Abraham drew from the founding fathers in order to get Americans to the land of promise, the fulfillment of the founders' highest intentions, which they committed to paper when they said that it was a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. This is why we invited this afternoon's speaker. Richard Brookhiser, senior editor at National Review, for which he has been writing since the age of 15. The magazine published as a cover story an article he wrote about anti-war protests at his high school. His articles have also appeared in The New Yorker, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic Monthly, Time, Vanity Fair, and other places. He's the author of at least a dozen books, most of them focused on the American founding. They include a book I teach every year in American Government, Founding Father, Rediscovering George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, American, and James Madison. His most recent book, my personal favorite, Founder's Son, A Life of Abraham Lincoln. Upon viewing the monumental Civil War documentary by Ken Burns, columnist George Will wrote, "Our Iliad found its Homer." With his elegant and incisive biographies, Richard Brookhiser, I believe, has become our American Plutarch. His books tell us about individuals whose lives are examples from which we can learn not just in our heads, but in our hearts. The novelist Marilynne Robinson once said that when reading some books, true comprehension has an ethical content. Tonight's speaker, I think, has written at least a few books with this as his goal. So to address the topic, Lincoln and the Founders, Slavery, War, and a New Birth of Freedom, we have Richard Brookhiser.
Thank you, Professor Morrell, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out on this delightful spring day. My wife is back in New York where they're getting 2 to 4 inches of snow, so you can count your blessings. This is my 4th time at Washington and Lee, and my 2nd time speaking in the Lee Chapel. The first time I spoke here, I spoke about George Washington, and this evening I'm speaking about Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things I hope to show is that that is a logical succession. One of the questions, common sort of what-if historical question, is who had the harder time, Washington or Lincoln? It's also asked as who was the greater man, same version of the same question. And you can say that both these men took America through the most dangerous and consequential wars in our history. Washington's war being the Revolution, Lincoln's the Civil War. But after Washington's war, he was president of the Constitutional Convention. And then he put the new Constitution into effect by being the first president. So that when Washington died, Henry Lee, Robert's father, could say that he was first in war and first in peace. After Lincoln's war, he was murdered. So his work, though very important, was still left incomplete. Now this evening, I want to talk about principles, plans, and hopes. Lincoln got his principles from the Founding Fathers. The 2 most important to him were George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Washington showed him the importance of liberty, and Jefferson showed him how to talk about the problem of slavery. Lincoln had a plan in the 1850s, in 1854, the turning point of his adult life, a plan for putting these principles into operation as America was vexed by the question of slavery. And he ran on this plan for Senate in 1858 unsuccessfully, and then for the presidency in 1860 successfully. Then the Civil War changed everything. Wars are disruptive, wars are urgent. And Lincoln modified his plans. He came up with new ones, not contradictory ones, but new ones. And a couple of them failed, a couple of them worked. And then after his war, he expressed his hopes for the future that he would never live to see. So let me begin with his principles and with the Founding Fathers. We're here for the Institute of Honor. And the Bible tells us to honor thy father. And Lincoln honored the Founding Fathers all of his life. The first one he encountered was the greatest one, George Washington. And he encountered him when he was a boy in the first great American biography, The Life of George Washington by Parson Weems. Now, Parson Weems was an ordained clergyman, but on the title page of his book, he identifies himself as the rector of Mount Vernon Parish. There was no such parish. Weems was not the rector of any parish. He actually made his living as an itinerant bookseller and as a publisher. He would go up and down the East Coast selling his stock of books, many of them written and printed by himself. He had met George Washington once, came to one lunch at Mount Vernon, and he'd written him one letter. And he realized that when Washington died, A Life of Washington would be a bestseller. So Washington dies in 1799. Weems is out with A Life of Washington the following year. And then in 1808, he brings out an expanded edition. This is the year before Abraham Lincoln is born. And this is the book that Lincoln reads probably when he's a boy, still in Kentucky, which is where he was born and where he lives for the first 7 years of his life. And what Lincoln got from Weems's book was not the stories of Washington as a good boy, not the famous stories of his childhood like the cherry tree. What most impressed Lincoln in Weems was the stories of Washington as a great man, particularly his leadership in the Battle of Trenton. And we know this because Lincoln said so himself. In 1861, when he's an adult and he's on his way to his first inauguration as president, Lincoln took a train from his home in Illinois, went through 7 states in the Midwest and the Northeast. He was showing the flag on his way to his inauguration, speaking briefly at every stop. And when he passed through New Jersey, he went through the state capital at Trenton, where he addressed the state senate. And he told them that back in his childhood, he had read Weems's Life of Washington, and that of all the battles that Weems recounted, the one that made the greatest impression on him was the battle there at Trenton. This was the battle fought in December of 1776, the desperate attack on the pursuing enemy. Washington had spent the preceding 6 months retreating. He had been driven out of Long Island, driven out of New York City, driven out of New York State, driven across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. And then at the end of the year, he turns, crosses the Delaware, and captures 900 Hessian troops at Trenton, suffering only a few casualties. One of them was James Monroe, who was injured in the attack. And Lincoln recalls this for the legislatures. He speaks of the crossing of the Delaware, of the sufferings of the men in this winter battle, and of the struggle with the Hessians. But then Lincoln says, "Boy though I was, it struck me that there must have been something important that those men struggled for, something more important even than a fight for independence, something that would matter to all people and all times." And what that was a struggle for liberty. And this is the sign to me that Lincoln is truly recalling Weems's book and not just talking in general about the Battle of Trenton. Because if you read the Life of Washington, that is exactly what Weems says about the Battle of Trenton. Once he's described the crossing of the Delaware, the troops still have to march a few miles before they come to the town. And Weems introduces an allegorical figure. It's a woman hovering over the American troops. And he says, this is the spirit of liberty. She's been driven out of Europe. She's come to America as her last refuge. But her enemies have followed her with soldiers and armies. Who will defend her? Only this ragged band of men. Weems presents the Battle of Trenton as a struggle for the fate of liberty in the world. And when he gets the American army to the edge of town, the words that he gives Washington before the Americans charge is, "All I ask of you men is to remember what you are about to fight for." In 1861, Abraham Lincoln remembered it. And he remembered it because he had read it as a boy in Weems's book back in Kentucky. Now that was a childhood experience. The Lincoln family moved when he was 7 years old to Indiana in 1816, and then in 1830, when he was 21, they moved to Illinois, which is where Lincoln lived and worked for the rest of his life until he became president. He bumbled around at a variety of odd jobs, and then he chose law and politics. He taught himself the law, and he became a politician. But in his adulthood, in 1854, in his 40s, he turns to another founding father to help him deal with the question which is vexing America, which is slavery. And this is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is a complicated man. He had a long life. He had what his enemies called a devious personality. Alexander Hamilton called him a contemptible hypocrite. That's the harsh view. James Madison said that Jefferson was able to speak in round terms, giving the impressions of the moment. That's the favorable view. I sometimes feel that Jefferson's mind is a mansion with many rooms, and they don't all have connecting doors. But the Jefferson that Lincoln admired, the Jefferson that Lincoln turned to, was the young, idealistic Jefferson, who, when he's 33 years old, writes the Declaration of Independence for the Continental Congress. And what Lincoln focuses on is the first of the self-evident truths, that all men are created equal. Lincoln will turn to this again and again in the 1850s and the 1860s. In 1859, he's invited to Boston to go to a celebration of Jefferson's birthday, and he can't make it because he has legal business, but he sends them remarks that he wants read, and he clearly labored over them because he wanted to make sure he got it right. And there he said that Jefferson expressed the definitions and axioms of a free society. And he ended, all honor to Jefferson, who had the coolness and forecast to insert into a merely revolutionary document a statement that should be of value to all men and at all times. Those are almost the words that Lincoln would use to describe Washington at the Battle of Trenton when he's talking to the New Jersey legislature. That was a battle. What Jefferson did was a document, a founding document. And of course, the greatest expression of Lincoln's admiration would come in the Declaration of Independence, because there, the new nation conceived in liberty is founded by our fathers 77 years ago. 77 is 87, 87 from 1863 is 1776. He's identifying the Declaration as the starting and defining point of the United States. And later on in the Gettysburg Address, when he speaks of a new birth of freedom, he doesn't say a birth of new freedom. He's talking about a new birth of freedom. It's the old freedom, Jefferson's freedom. It has to be born anew because we've strayed from it. But that's what Lincoln wants us to return to. Now, there are two other founding events associated with Jefferson that were very important for Lincoln. One was the Northwest Ordinance, and the other was the banning of the slave trade in 1808. After the war, Jefferson goes to the Continental Congress, and in 1784, he proposes to Congress that all of the United States' territories, which in those days were everything west of the Appalachians all the way to the Mississippi, which was then our western border, Jefferson proposed that those territories should be free of slavery. Now, this was the old Congress, which was one house. All the states had an equal vote. You could send 2 to 5 delegates to Congress, but they would only cast one vote for your state. And Jefferson's proposal fails. The story is that one of the guys from New Jersey showed up late, so their vote wasn't cast the right way. New Yorkers like to blame things on New Jersey, and Jefferson blamed this on New Jersey too. And the following year, he went to Paris to be minister to France, but his idea was revived. In 1787, the old Congress prohibited slavery not in all the territories, but in the old Northwest, which is everything west of Pennsylvania, between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes, over to the Mississippi. And this would become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a slice of Minnesota. This passed Congress in the summer of 1787, so it's older than the Constitution. This was passed while the Constitutional Convention was meeting. The Constitutional Convention meets in Philadelphia from May to September 1787. The Northwest Ordinance happens in the middle of that time. In fact, there are a couple of men who are both in Congress and at the Constitutional Convention. So Congress is at Fraunces Tavern in New York. The Constitutional Convention is at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And these guys have to go to both places, and they vote in support of both things. Now, the Constitution is ratified by the end of 1788, and it goes into effect in 1789. And one of the first acts of the new Congress, the Congress we now have with a House and a Senate, is to confirm the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And the new president, George Washington, will sign that bill into law. The Northwest Ordinance was vitally important to Abraham Lincoln because that's the reason his family left Kentucky. One of the reasons Thomas Lincoln left Kentucky was that he couldn't afford a slave. He was a subsistence farmer, and he didn't want to compete with slave owners. He also belonged to a particular Baptist church which thought that slavery was a sin. So he took his family to the brand new state of Indiana, part of the old Northwest Territory, which was free of slavery. And then in 1830, he moves again to Illinois, another state carved out of the old Northwest Territory, also free of slavery. So the Northwest Ordinance shaped Lincoln's life, and it shaped his world. The second episode that Thomas Jefferson took part in was the decision in 1808 to ban the slave trade. The Constitution said that the slave trade could not be banned for 20 years from the ratification of this document. The Constitution is ratified in 1788, so 20 years is 1808. This is the end of Thomas Jefferson's second term as president. And in 1807, a year ahead of time, Congress votes and Jefferson signs a bill saying that the next year the slave trade will be banned. And Lincoln thought that these measures were significant because they showed a practical plan by the founding fathers how to restrict slavery. As he put it in 1858, they blocked its expansion in one direction and they cut off its source in the other and put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. Now, Lincoln would have a plan of his own beginning in 1854 for dealing with the issue of slavery, and it had two elements. One was containment, and one was ultimate extinction. Now, why does slavery have to be contained in 1854? It has to be contained because suddenly it is growing. At the beginning of the decade, America had gone all the way to the Pacific coast. Everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific was under the flag of the United States, and all of that land was either states or territories. Everything east of the Mississippi is a state. Texas is a state. Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa are states. California is a state. But the plains, the Southwest, the Rockies, the Northwest, those are territories. But all of these states and territories had been assigned to be free states and territories or slave states and territories. And these decisions had been made in two complicated compromises, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, both of them engineered by Henry Clay. As Lincoln would put it, every square inch of land we owned had been determined to be slave or free. And that was the arrangement that seemed like the final balance. But in 1854, this balance is destroyed. and it's destroyed by a man Lincoln knows and has been fighting politically for years, Stephen Douglass, senator from Illinois. He's been much more successful than Lincoln. He's serving his second term as senator. He's been talked about as a presidential candidate. Lincoln has only had 2 years as a member of the House of Representatives, and he's been out practicing law for 5. But Douglass, in 1854, pushes a bill through Congress which opens Kansas and Nebraska to slavery. Now, Kansas and Nebraska had been reserved to freedom in the Missouri Compromise 34 years earlier, but Douglass is opening them to slavery. And he's doing it under the banner of local control, or what he calls popular sovereignty. And his position is, why should we have these elaborate compromises in Washington? Why can't we just let the people who live there make the decision? That's the American way. Lincoln thought this was appalling. He thought this was turning our backs on the statement of the Declaration of Independence. He gave a speech in Peoria, Illinois, where he said, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution." And this is the position that he will maintain for the next 6 years. Now, he's also calling, not just for containment, but he's also calling for ultimate extinction. He wants to put an end point to the process, a point at which slavery will no longer exist. Lincoln's very patient about this. He's not calling for extinction tomorrow. At one point, he writes a note to himself where he says, "It may not happen in my natural life." On another occasion in 1858, he's debating Stephen Douglass. He's running against him for the Senate, wants to take his Senate seat. And he says in public that this may not happen for a century. So in other words, slavery will be extinct in the second administration of Dwight Eisenhower, 1958. Maybe Nixon could have run on it in 1960. I was Eisenhower's vice president when we ended slavery 2 years ago, and I'm very proud of that act. But Lincoln was patient, but his patience was not endless. He wanted to make it clear that slavery would have to have a definite end. And another speech he gives in 1858 says that either slavery will be put in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it not just into Kansas and Nebraska, but into the entire country. And he quotes the Bible, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." This speech is known as the House Divided speech. And when he read that paragraph before giving the speech to some of his Republican supporters, they were a little shocked. It seemed too forthright for them. One called it a damn fool utterance. But Lincoln wanted to show that though he was patient, he was also firm. He would wait a long time, but the time must come when slavery would end. So this was Lincoln's program. When he's running against Douglass in 1858, he loses that election. But 2 years later, he runs against Douglass again for the presidency. There are 2 other men in that presidential contest. The Democratic Party is split in 2. There's a Southern Democrat who doesn't even bother with local control. He just wants slavery in all the territories flat out. And then there's a 4th party called Constitutional Union, and their position on slavery was, well, let's not talk about it at all. And Lincoln said this is the only thing anyone wants to talk about, but that was their position, and they finished 4th, although they got 12% of the vote. Lincoln wins. He has a minority of the popular vote, only 40%, but a solid majority in the Electoral College. And if the 3 opponents had banded together, he still would have won a majority in the Electoral College. In December of 1860, he writes an old friend who lives in Georgia, and he says to him that he has no intention of freeing Georgia's slaves or any existing slaves, but he says, we believe that slavery is wrong and ought to be restricted. You believe that it's right and ought to be extended. I suppose that is the rub. And it was the rub. When he wrote that letter, South Carolina had already seceded. In January, 5 more states would follow South Carolina. Texas would go in February. Lincoln is inaugurated in March. Inaugurations were in March then, not in January. And then the last 4 states, including Virginia, would go after the attack on Fort Sumter in April. So now Lincoln is in the midst of a civil war, and he has to come up with new plans. One plan he comes up with is compensation. Maybe the way out of the problem is to buy our way out of the problem. Throughout the war, he makes offers to slave states, both in the Union and out of it, that the federal government will give them money to buy the slaves from their slave owners and free them. Now remember that there are 11 states have seceded, but 4 slave states have stayed in the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Of course, Kentucky is Lincoln's home state. He's supposed to have said, I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. He did say that to lose Kentucky would be to lose the whole game. It took the Union over 2 years to take the Mississippi River. If Kentucky had seceded, they would have been fighting over the Ohio River. It would have been a hopeless task. But Lincoln goes to the governors of those 4 loyal slave states in 1862, and he asks, won't you take federal money to buy out your slave owners and free those slaves? He makes a special offer to Delaware because he thinks Delaware is the easiest case. It's a small state. There are only 1,800 slaves. So he says to Delaware, I'll give you over $700,000 if you free your slaves by 1893. Nobody takes any of these offers. At the end of 1862, he proposes a constitutional amendment to Congress, which would offer money to the loyal states and the southern states. If the southern states are willing to come back to the Union, we will give them money to pay their slave owners and free their slaves. Congress will not enact that amendment. And as late as February 1865, 2 months before Appomattox, Lincoln says to his cabinet, look, the war is costing us $3 million a day. If we offer $400 million to the South to quit by July 1st and free all their slaves, that will actually be cheaper. And the entire cabinet says, no, don't think about this. Lincoln, of course, wants to end the bloodshed. But he also has a moral point. When he proposes his amendment to Congress in December of 1862, he says in the course of his speech that we of the North use cotton and sugar. In other words, we're all implicated in slavery. The free states don't have clean hands. So we should all pay to end this problem. But as I said, no one was interested in these plans. A second plan of Lincoln's was colonization. This was a very old plan. There was a group called the American Colonization Society, which tried to encourage free blacks to move back to Africa. This would be solving our race problem by getting rid of one of our races. Liberia was actually created by the American Colonization Society. That was a nation which grew out of several thousand free blacks who had accepted the offer and gone to Africa. Some other places that Lincoln considers when he's president: there's an island off the coast of Haiti, Ile Vache, Cow Island. He thought of that as a possible place. He was also interested in the south coast of Panama. And he has a meeting at the White House in 1862 with a group of black men picked by churches in Washington, D.C., and he tries to sell them on the Panama idea. And we have a transcript of his remarks, and he says, if I could only get 100 men to do this, or if I could get 50, or if I could get 25. You know, it's like a Dutch auction. He's trying to see when they will bite. And of course they don't. I mean, they're polite to his face, but no one is interested in this at all because they're Americans. They don't want to go to Panama. They want to stay where they were born and grew up. So colonization is another plan that does not work. The third plan of his, which does, is liberation. In August of 1862, he tells his cabinet that he will announce that all the slaves in parts of the United States still in rebellion will be freed in January of the new year. The cabinet is shocked, but they go along with it. The Secretary of State, William Seward, though, says, don't announce this now. Wait until we have a victory. If we announce it now, it will look like desperation. The next battle after that conversation is Second Bull Run, or Second Manassas, which is a crushing Union defeat. But the battle after that, in September of 1862, is Antietam, which is close enough. And so Lincoln announces the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It's basically an announcement of an announcement. This is going to happen by January 1st of the new year, and it does happen then. Now, the common criticism of the Emancipation Proclamation from that day to this is that Lincoln was freeing slaves that he had no control over, because it was addressed only to slaves in portions of the country which were still in rebellion. It did not apply to the loyal slave states. It didn't apply to parts of the Confederacy that were under Union control. It didn't apply to New Orleans. It didn't apply to West Virginia. But the reason it's so restricted is that Lincoln has no power to free slaves by proclamation anywhere else. The proclamation is not a law. It is not passed by Congress. It is an executive act, and he can only do it as commander-in-chief in time of a rebellion. And he uses that phrase repeatedly during both the preliminary and the final Emancipation Proclamations. If he had tried to free by proclamation slaves belonging to loyal Southerners or loyal residents of Missouri and Kentucky, would have gone to court. It would never have stood up. So he does the most he can. And then in 1864, he does more. He lobbies for the passage of the 13th Amendment. If you saw the Spielberg movie, that's what the Spielberg movie is all about. This is an amendment which will end slavery throughout the United States. It gets the necessary 2/3 vote in the Senate, but it fails in the House. It gets a majority, but it's not 2/3. Then Lincoln tries again in the lame duck session, and he manages to push it through so that on January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment passes through Congress and will go out to the states for ratification. And it's reported that the people in the gallery cheered and wept at that moment. By that amendment, 4 million men, women, and children were freed. But Lincoln has one more plan, or maybe it's better to call it a state of mind, and that is penance. And he announces this in his second inaugural in March of 1865. The second inaugural is by far the most religious inaugural address any president has given. One of the most religious political speeches in American history. This was something new for Lincoln. He was not a religious young man. He'd read Thomas Paine in The Age of Reason. Like many 20-year-olds, he thought, oh, this is just great. Look, the Bible is full of contradictions. Who can take it seriously? I certainly don't. In fact, when Lincoln was in his early 20s, he wrote a Thomas Paine-like pamphlet of his own, in which he was going to argue that Jesus was an ordinary, illegitimate child and that no one should pay attention to the Bible. He told his friends this. He was working as a postmaster at that time, and postmasters in those days didn't have post offices. They had desks in stores where they conducted their business. So Lincoln is in the store, and he's telling all his pals this. And then the owner of the store, older man, Samuel Hill, asks to see the pamphlet. Lincoln gives it to him, and Hill puts it in the stove, burns it. Because young Lincoln is already interested in politics, and Samuel Hill knows you're not going to win office in Illinois in the 1830s if you write pamphlets saying that Jesus is an ordinary illegitimate child. So he spares Lincoln that fate. Lincoln learned to be more circumspect about his views, and then at some point his views changed. It's hard to say exactly when. Lincoln is not a self-revealing man. He never kept a diary or a journal. His letters are mostly all business. Maybe it had to do with the death of his son Edward in 1850. Certainly the death of his son William while he was president also didn't help. Obviously, the big thing weighing on him is the cost of the war. I'll just tell you one story about Lincoln visiting a soldier's hospital. This was something he and his wife often did. And on this particular visit, a reporter named Noah Brooks is accompanying him as he goes down the line of beds. And ahead of them, there's a woman who's giving out charitable tracts. And she gives one to one soldier, and he picks it up and sort of laughs and tosses it down. And Lincoln and the reporter come up to him, and Lincoln says, you know, she's just trying to be helpful. It probably wasn't nice to laugh at her pamphlet. And the soldier says, well, she gave me a pamphlet on the sin of dancing, and both my legs have been shot off. So you multiply this by 10 and by 100 and by 1,000 and by 10,000 and by 100,000. And that's what the Civil War is. Of course, all these casualty reports are coming directly to the commander-in-chief. So in March 1865, Lincoln is finally ready to tell America what it all means, or at least what he thinks it means. And he says, as he's coming to the conclusion of his inaugural address, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war shall pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So when Lincoln offered to pay for slaves, to buy them out, no one was taking it. But now he's saying, we have paid. We have paid, we're paying. We're paying money, and we're paying blood. And we're paying for a sin that we have all committed, North and South. What struck me reading this is that the founders are gone. The founding fathers aren't enough for this moment. He has to turn to another father, which is God the Father, and a very punitive and exacting father that God is. In the Gettysburg Address, he went 7 years ago back to 1776. But now he's talking about 250 years of unrequited toil. 250 from 1865 is 1615. That is Jamestown, the first American colony, the first colony to buy slaves from Africa. And now Lincoln says, we are paying for it, we must pay. But he has hopes. Days after Appomattox, he gives a speech from the White House to a celebrating crowd on the lawn, April 11th. And in those brief remarks, he addresses two classes of people who've been outside his political world for most of his term. The first class is white Southerners in rebellion. he is urging that the formerly seceded states be readmitted to the Union as soon as possible. This was not a universal opinion in the Republican Party. Many people wanted to treat the South as a conquered domain. Some wanted to carve it up into new states altogether. Lincoln's position was, well, secession was never legal. They never really left the Union, so we should get them back as soon as possible. But he also has a task in mind for those southern states. He said, if we admit them, they can vote for the 13th Amendment. He wants them to participate in the solution. And again, this is a contested point. There are Republicans who say, why should they get to vote on the 13th Amendment? It should only be ratified by 3/4 of the states that were loyal. These are the states that left because of slavery. Why should they get to vote on the amendment ending it? That's not Lincoln's view. He wants them to have agency, and he wants them to participate in the healing process. The other class of people that he's addressing is blacks. And they were missing from the second inaugural, too. It's a great speech, but the blacks hardly exist in it. They're only occasions for the national sin. But now he addresses them directly. He had written a private letter to the new governor of Louisiana. Louisiana was the first seceded state that was applying for readmission. And Lincoln wrote him a private letter and approving the Constitution, but proposed new Constitution of the state, but saying he would prefer if the franchise were extended to black veterans and to the very intelligent. That was a private letter. But now on April 11th, he says this in public. He's making a public suggestion that black veterans and the very intelligent be allowed to vote. Then he adds that with energy and vigilance and daring, the black man will be encouraged to struggle for his rights. One of the people in the audience was John Wilkes Booth, and when he heard that, he turned to one of his cronies and said, that means nigger citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever give. And Booth was right on both counts. Lincoln was considering black citizenship, urging it, and that was the last speech he ever gave. And perhaps I should end there because that's where Lincoln ended. Andrew Johnson had good qualities. He was a brave man, he was a patriotic man. But he was a man boiling with resentments. He was not a good politician. He didn't know how to bring people of different mind together. And so the term he served after he succeeded Lincoln was wasted in controversies and fights. Grant did the best he could, but finally the country tired of those efforts, and civil rights would not begin to come until Eisenhower's second term, actually. But I shouldn't end there, because even if hopes are deferred, they can be recalled. That's what Lincoln had done. He thought we'd strayed from the founders' principles, but he wanted to get back to them, and he made an effort to do it. So if the country strayed from Lincoln's principles, it could still go back to them. So I want to end with the last sentence of the second inaugural, which is not about God's punishments, but it's about what we should do, what we have to do now. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And when I came to write about that, I noticed how many of those verbs and verb phrases are 2 syllables. Strive on, finish, bind up, care for, achieve, cherish. It sounds like walking. It's as simple as walking. It's as hard as walking when you've walked so long and you still have a long way to go. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a book signing in a few minutes, but if there are a couple of questions, I think we have time for that. The book signing will be at Washington Hall. Any questions?
I talked a long time. I hope I'd get off. Okay, yes. Right, the question was Lincoln loved Shakespeare. The whole question of what Lincoln read and liked is an interesting one. Lincoln was entirely self-taught. If you add up all his schooling, it equals a year. And there were a lot of people who were better read than Abraham Lincoln. His young law partner, William Herndon, man 9 years younger, law partner for 16 years, adored Lincoln, wrote an early biography of him. Herndon read everybody. I mean, he read transcendentalists, and he read European philosophers, and he was extremely well read. Lincoln was more narrowly focused, but what he read very deeply. He liked certain poets. His favorite was Byron. He also liked Burns. But his favorite of all was Shakespeare, dramatist, but also a poet. And I think the plays he liked best were the tragedies and the histories. He did like Falstaff, but the plays that he refers to most are tragedies and histories. And this reflects partly the fact that Lincoln was depressed. We always have to remember it. This is a depressed man. The jokes were compensation. One friend of mine calls them self-medication. Lincoln had a million jokes, but there were more than one time when people who knew him said we had to hide the razors. And then, of course, he becomes president during the Civil War, which would justify any depressed person's gloomiest view of the world. But no, he loved Shakespeare, and his favorite play was Macbeth. And he recites lines from it after he visits Richmond after the fall of Richmond, and when he's coming back on the boat to Washington, he recites the lines where Macbeth is saying that Macduff must be better off because he's dead. He can no longer be bothered by treason. It's a very kind of gloomy rumination. Anything else? Okay. Oh, yes, sir.
The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive action. The current administration is considering many executive actions. Are there any parallels?
Well, I mean, Lincoln was very careful in the Emancipation Proclamation to show where his authority lay. And he's saying, I am doing this as commander-in-chief, and I'm doing this as commander-in-chief during a rebellion. And the Constitution forbids the suspension of habeas corpus, except in times of rebellion or invasion. So there are, the Constitution kind of carves that out or suggests that's an area where unusual things may be done. And they were done. I mean, Congress, well, first Lincoln declared national suspension of habeas corpus, and then the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Congress has to. So Congress said, okay, fine. Here it is. And similarly, I mean, Lincoln is a lawyer, and he knows. I mean, if he frees one slave who is not in these narrow circumstances, that's going to go straight to court, and the Chief Justice is still Roger Taney, who gave us the Dred Scott decision. So, he doesn't want to do that. Yes.
How did Mr. Lincoln plan to deal with the national sovereignty questions that would arise from the colonization proposals? For example, you mentioned the southern coast of Panama, which belonged to, I believe, Colombia. Columbia.
Yes. Well, he was, I mean, he was negotiating with the government of Colombia. If there'd been any interest, I mean, the next step would have, then he'd already sent out some feelers, but, you know, then they would have seriously talked and maybe tried to buy it. I mean, it's interesting. The people in his cabinet, the person in his cabinet who was most in favor of this was the Postmaster General Montgomery Blair. And he was from this politically potent family. His father, the patriarch, was this old Jackson Democrat, and he and his brother were similarly like the father. And they didn't like black people. Didn't like slavery, didn't like black people, wanted them out of the country, but they also thought, well, they'll be the vanguards of American power in the Caribbean basin. You know, we'll have like these colonies of liberated blacks that we've sent forth, and they will do our bidding. I mean, it sounds almost crackpot, but you know, so do a lot of things, and sometimes one of them happens, but this one didn't.
We're going to have a panel tomorrow
Okay.
after the two speakers deliver their remarks. So if you have remaining questions from this talk or anything you hear from now until tomorrow, hold on to them till then. Thank you very much.